Terminator Dark Fate was directed by Tim Miller from a screenplay that was written by a lot of people. It is technically the 6th installment in the franchise, but when you think about what has happened since the release of Terminator Genisys, and the series has kind of like declined in terms of its commercial and critical success, there's been a lot of panic among the studios to try to figure out why it wasn't really connecting with audiences and what they needed to do in order to turn things around so it could once again be lucrative. So what they did is they brought back not only James Cameron to produce the film and to help out with the film's story, but they also brought back Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor. Of course, they brought back Arnold Schwarzenegger again as a T-800 because, I mean, why not? And they decided to pull 2018 Halloween with the Terminator franchise by basically saying that Terminator 3, Terminator Salvation, Terminator Genisys, and the Sarah Chronicles TV show, and we're like, that stuff doesn't matter anymore. It's not canon. What we're making here is the official sequel to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, because this is the story that James Cameron wanted, and this is what we're going to go with now if we're going to continue this series. I'm going to have to say that this video is going to have spoilers in it, because with that and the creative impetus behind this movie has to be discussed with what happens in literally like the first 5 to 10 minutes of the movie, and I don't feel as if I could really fully tell my thoughts on this movie without spoiling what happens there and kind of how it impacts the rest of the narrative. So if you want to see Terminator Dark Fate but don't want to have any spoilers ruin your experience, then just go ahead and watch this video after you see the movie, and then you'll kind of see where I'm coming from without it having to ruin the initial experience for you. So a few years after Terminator 2 Judgment Day ended, we see Sarah and John Connor have basically gone off the grid in Central America, and they're trying to be free of the life that they once lived in the United States because, you know, Sarah Connor is now officially labeled as an enemy of the state. But Sarah also wanted a quieter life for John so that he can just grow up and enjoy life without having to be thought of as being brought up for one specific purpose in saving humanity. But that plan absolutely goes to crap when another T-800 somehow finds John in this little restaurant by the sea, and he just walks up and shoots him right there with a shotgun. So yeah, within the first 5 minutes, John Connor is dead. I don't know. Look, the actual decision to kill John Connor, you know, I'm not really against that idea, because if they used that idea correctly and went about it in the right way, that could have been potentially interesting. You know, like if perhaps John survived within like half the movie and his contribution to the series meant something beyond just, you know, being barely mentioned in the first movie and then playing a much bigger role in the second. But this is just such a thankless and useless way to kill off his character. Because we experienced the entirety of Terminator 2, we got to know the guy and we got to appreciate his personality, but literally the whole entire point of Terminator 2 was to protect John Connor, because he was going to be the one that would ultimately save humanity. But after they did everything they could to prevent Judgment Day, you know, his quote-unquote purpose basically didn't exist anymore. But that doesn't mean you don't kill off that character for that reason. And to explain more of why this really angered me after a while is because what they essentially do is that after this takes place, the actual narrative of the story happens 22 years later, 2020 to be exact, in which basically the same exact thing from the first 2 movies happen. This time it's a woman returning back from the future to protect someone who would be important to the fight in the future. This woman being a cyborg named Grace, who underwent a bunch of different, you know, cybernetic enhancements so that she could be a more useful asset to the military effort at the time. While at the same time, another advanced prototype of a Terminator, despite not being necessarily a Cyberdyne model, returns to the year 2020 as well to hunt down someone named Daniela Ramos. She just happens to be this random woman who works for a car production facility, and when this new Terminator known as a Rev 9 shows up to kill her father and her brother, what happens is that Grace intervenes, manages to save her from that horrible situation. Linda Hamilton, Sarah Connor comes in, and eventually we meet Carl, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the same T-800 who killed John Connor, but eventually allowed his AI to basically forget that he was this ruthless killing machine, and it's almost like he just... Guys, I can't even, like, I can't even with what they did with Arnold Schwarzenegger in this movie. They seriously wrote his character to be a Terminator who grew feelings after he killed John Connor and realized, oh, that was horrible. I shouldn't have killed John. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to settle down. I'm going to get a wife who I don't have any sex with ever. We just happen to be together. And I'm going to raise a kid, and I'm going to hang draperies. There are some interesting things that go on with this character. I mean, the little conflict that happens between Sarah and Carl, in which, Sarah thinks that the T-100 is still this ruthless killing machine and wants to get revenge for him killing John. But at the same time, this Terminator now has developed some sort of conscience, so to speak. I mean, they literally call it that in the movie. And he has to basically convince Sarah that he is now on her side and wants to try to help her in the war effort against, all the other T-800s that showed up when he did, and also help her eliminate the other Terminators that came from the new reality, which Grace came from. The whole entire aspect with Carl either should have been rewritten completely or not included in this movie, because there are so many weird and just awkward plot holes that come up because of this, and I didn't believe for a second that this robot, who never really had any of his programming tampered with, would just on his own develop the ability to not want to kill humans anymore. That was just ridiculous to me, on top of him literally settling down and having this quiet, secluded family life. But on top of that, what really angers me about the choice to kill John Connor and then introduce this new character, Daniela Ramos, who's basically a substitute for John Connor, is that there seemed to have been, and this is only an assumption, I'm not really saying this is actually what happened, but the way that it comes across in the movie is that they figured in order to make it more appealing to modern audiences, they had to get rid of the male protagonist and put in a female one for no reason other than to just appeal to a certain audience. It's weird because there's a scene in which they reveal to Danny why she was basically chosen to be the replacement for John Connor, is that she would eventually be this motivational speaker who would rally everybody together and convince them to unite in their fight against Legion, which is basically just a new shoe-in for Skynet. And that's literally the only trait she has. Like, there's no other real convincing reason for us to believe that she would be the leader of this resistance effort than just, oh, you're going to inspire hope in people. You're going to walk up, say some things, and then they'll eventually turn from scavengers into people who are willing to put aside their differences and fight. It is a hopeful idea, yes, but I just never really felt like it was all that convincing. There weren't many scenes that led me to believe that Danny was going to be this character who would eventually unite everybody in the resistance effort. But the problem is also that the film seems to treat Sarah and John's relationship as a bad thing, and the fact that Sarah was more or less reminiscent to the Virgin Mary. And again, I'm not trying to make any sort of shallow assumption here. I mean, they reference Mary with regards to Sarah Connor, and with the way that the dialogue is written and the characters speak about these things, it almost has this attitude of, we shouldn't have done that in the first place in writing Sarah Connor's character, and now we're doing course correction to make it more quote-unquote appealing to everybody. But the result is that they crap on the legacy of the original movies by doing so. And what we get as a result are recycled elements from the first two movies in what's essentially just a retread of Terminator 2. I'm completely fine with the performances in this movie. They're, for the most part, pretty compelling, especially Mackenzie Davis as Grace. If someone wanted to make an action movie and have Mackenzie Davis be the sole star of that movie, I'd be all for it. Additionally, Gabriel Luna does a pretty good job as a new Terminator, but none of them really stand out in comparison to the original characters because there's something about the way that they're written that just doesn't really make you feel as if there's enough emotional stakes with what's going on. Even for Sarah Connor. Like, I can't tell you how many action scenes there were in which they'd be in danger and they were about to be attacked by the Terminator, and then they would just so nonchalantly say, here, do this. They would announce what they're doing, but there was no urgency or emotion in what they were saying. And even in some of the more dramatic scenes in which they had to have more intimate conversations and talk about some of the things that were on their mind, they would sufficiently deliver their lines in a competent way, but still there was no urgency to what was being said. And I feel that's a major problem with this movie as well. Stakes. The action sequences and the plot do very little to establish any real tension. In what is already pretty much a remake of Terminator 2 with updated CGI and different characters, I expected there to be a bit more risk-taking and more opportunities for them to do something different than what had been done in previous movies. But no, a lot of the same elements are repeated here, and you would expect that for a franchise formula to do that. But you have to be unique enough with your choices in order to feel as if you're creating an unpredictable, suspenseful, and compelling narrative. But no, Terminator Dark Fate just checks all the boxes for the Terminator essential formula. It even ends with a fight that occurs in like some kind of industrial complex. For every Terminator movie I've seen, they end like this, where they have a bunch of different action scenes that aren't necessarily connected with one another, but then they always end in like this random industrial facility, whether or not it's a factory or a steel mill. And now this one in which, they're basically in a complex for a dam. What disappointed me about these action scenes is that even though there were some ones in the early sections of the movie which did have some practical effects and were cut together decently well, there is so much quick cutting and fast camera movements to where I could never really bask in the amazing imagery that was being shown to me. And there was just so much fast movements to where sometimes these action sequences just got draining for me to watch. They would go on, and there were many quick cuts and just fast camera angles. A lot of them were just flashy images to break up some of the monotony of the dialogue-driven scenes, and not really anything to propel the tension of the narrative forward. Terminator 2 did this perfectly because even though there are certainly many sequences in which there are just conversations between characters, they were compelling conversations, and then when the action sequences would start, the camera was deliberate enough to where there were steady shots, there were long enough angles in order for us to really get the sense of what was going on, and then there was enough tension there because they would continually build and build until the final sequence in which you have the T-1000, the T-800, John and Sarah Connor battling in the steel mill. Everything that we had seen up to that point was just leading up to the intensity of this final moment. But here the creative impulse didn't really seem to be trying to build up tension or suspense. It was basically just like, oh, what cool thing can we do now? Oh, let's have Grace knock the Terminator around with a giant sledgehammer. Oh, let's have them be in a cargo plane that's falling out of the sky. They were just trying to create a lot of flashy imagery with some very awkward slow motion shots rather than anything that was just suspenseful. I don't know, there's barely any tension in them, and they just get very monotonous after a while. And what's worse is that the use of CGI in this movie is just so over the top to where a lot of these sequences just felt fake. Every sequence from the first two movies feels real. They were limited by their budgets, not necessarily Terminator 2, but with the effects and the technology that they had, they did their best to make it look real. And even though some of the effects don't really work today, such as in the original Terminator when the skeletal form of the T-800 is kind of walking around and you can tell that it's stop motion, that final sequence is still terrifying because it's essentially like this figure from a slasher movie that's chasing down Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor and won't stop until it reaches their target. That's the same case with this movie's Terminator, the Rev 9, but because there's so much CGI used here to compensate for a lack of real practical effects or camera work, there just was a lack of tension there or realism because this was all just a bunch of flashy imagery. I don't really know who to blame for that, whether it's the director or where the producers wanted the budget to go, but I just didn't really like the direction that they took with the visual effects, and ultimately just pretty much everything else. Terminator Dark Fate is a very disappointing movie, and I say that as someone who wasn't even really wanting to see it in the first place. I had no real expectations for what this was going to be, but I still left feeling very underwhelmed because of the creative choices that were made with the story, how it doesn't really add up to anything compelling, and when you have a story that is trying to be something unique, something different and effective, you need to take risks so that people will be involved in your story and they'll really feel like, oh, they're trying hard here. They're really doing their best to surprise us and engage us. But Terminator Dark Fate is a very producer-friendly, safe movie that is trying to do their best to win back Terminator fans. But given how much money this movie has made already and will make, that hasn't happened. So with that, I'm giving Terminator Dark Fate a C-. As far as an age recommendation goes, Dark Fate isn't really all that far from where the originals were in terms of their inappropriate content. Yes, there is a fair amount of language here, so that's something you can look for. And also, consistent with the first two movies as well, in which people would basically arrive naked when they travel back in time. There's two characters who are like that as well, and the one that we see the most quote-unquote nudity with is Mackenzie Davis when she comes back. Thankfully there weren't enough close-up shots to really get full details as to what her body looks like, but I mean, you do see her buttocks a number of times, and it's very clear that there were some shots in which they shot her whole entire body, just with details obscured. This was never a problem for Gabriel Luna though, because he just shows up, and then after a few seconds he finds clothes. Otherwise, the action scenes are essentially what you would expect from your average everyday Marvel movie, just with a little bit of blood thrown in there, so I don't think you have to worry about that too much. Overall, I'd say The Dark Fate is best for anyone who's at least 14 years old. Thank you so much for watching as always, guys. I appreciate your support, and I know that I said some things that were a little bit risky in this particular review, but that's my opinion, that's how I feel, and I was just very disappointed with the direction they took here. But with that being said, look forward to more reviews coming soon, including a one in which I do some quick reviews for movies that I saw at the Scottsdale International Film Festival. It'll be in the same format that I did with my quick reviews for Jojo Rabbit, Lighthouse, and Parasite, so that should be pretty entertaining, and I hope to get that to you later this week. If you appreciate this content, please like and subscribe. It really does help me grow my content here. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching as always, and I hope you have a good one.